Welcome to Project Truthbook, a podcast about two regular dudes exploring biblical truths. Today we're talking about Calvinism, Molinism, and the spiritual gifts such as the gift of tongues. So my name is Alex. I'm here with one of my best buds, John. If you'd like to tell us a little bit about yourself there, John.
My name is John. I joked that I was an evangelifish earlier, but basically grew up in non-denominational churches. Currently attend a non-denominational church and
Closet Baptist.
Closet Baptist. No, I'm a Baptist. I mean, most non-denominational churches, let's just be real, are Baptist churches.
That's true.
Who don't want it, to be honest.
I don't get that. I don't understand why.
Yeah, I mean, every week we're doing baptisms by full immersion. So.
And no baby dunking because you're Baptist.
That's true. Yeah.
Well, there's a few things we want to laugh about today.
Yeah, we've been friends for like over a decade. Like I think I met you in like 2009, 2010.
Dude, that's crazy.
Yeah.
That's nuts.
So that's like 15 years.
That was the beginning of the end for me, though.
Everything went downhill after you met me.
Yes, that's true. That's not technically wrong. I always forget we used to live together.
Oh, yeah.
Which is weird.
Crazy.
Like, I still forget that was a thing.
I just remember that Supra waking me up every morning.
Totally worth it. Yeah, so I'm, I guess I'm also a Baptist. I use the word I guess because out of the two of us, I'm a little more...
You're like a Reformed Baptist.
Reformed Baptist,
yeah.
Which means we get to drink.
You have the elements there described as the bread and the wine, whereas our church says the cracker and the juice.
Yeah, although we don't use real wine, although I think that would be kind of cool. But there's some folks in my church that don't drink, which
sure,
totally fine, obviously.
Oh yeah.
But yeah, we've known each other for way too long, and we always find ourselves getting into some interesting theological conversations, so we thought it'd be worth recording it for once for fun. See what happens here.
So I'm, I have a little different I was raised in a non-denominational denomination called Calvary Chapel. That's my joke. So I'm dispensational. I believe in some of the spiritual gifts still being around, and but I feel, and you're Reformed Baptist, so you hold maybe to a little different eschatology and.
But not like hardcore Reformed Baptist.
Yeah, but not like hardcore. So, and I just find that your perspective helps me think about things more deeply. And
wow, really?
Yeah, because
you're not blowing smoke.
I have to think about stuff you say. I always I hear, even when I listen to podcasters like James White or, Dr. Michael Brown or something, I have to sit there and think about what they're saying. Is there, legitimacy what they're saying? Is it scriptural? And, I guess I've always been of the opinion that I could be wrong about a lot of things.
Well, yeah, and that's why I say technically a lot of things, because I also subscribe to the same, if I'm wrong, that's fine. Yeah. Like the core beliefs are there. We agree on, obviously, Jesus, salvation through faith alone.
Right. We're both Protestants.
Right, right. And so
So there's a lot of commonality.
But that's interesting. I don't think I've ever heard you say that I've made you think about certain things, because I'm able to talk deeply, but I've never done deep research on anything. It's more so just my gut and my if I think logically about how infinite God is, I arrive at conclusion XYZ, or rather the possibility of XYZ. Again, with the realization that I could be wrong. There's a few things that we are pretty confident in. We always joke about baby dunking. We are not pedo Baptists. And again, just looking at the evidence on that, which I'm sure we'll talk about at some point if it's not already on our list to talk about today. But yeah, I think so. Like I was saying, we wanted to put some conversations down in recording for fun.
Yeah.
See what happens. And
that's why I was so excited to do this, because honestly, I really enjoy, even when we're texting back and forth about things, I'm like, what do you think about this? And you're like, I don't know about that. And
yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. But that's so funny you say that. That's so, I genuinely did not know that.
Well, for example, when we were talking about Molinism on our drive to Santa Rosa and back.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you were like, and you were really tracking with the different, things, the facets of that. And then you were texting me later about it, and I had
Yeah.
to kind of think about what you were saying. I don't remember what it was, but I was
I think I was saying basically like, well, let's just talk about it. So basically, you give us a rundown on Molinism first, because not everyone might not know what that is.
I would say that Molinism is a model of how you could have libertarian free will in the conventional sense of how people think of libertarian free will, just having the freedom to actually do A or B or not A and B, right? If you're going to have that for humanity, that's like legitimate free will, and God being 100% sovereign over all things, like most Calvinists believe, right? Or all Calvinists believe, then Molinism is a model, a philosophical model, I guess you could say, to explain how they're both compatible with each other. It involves God's omniscience, right? So Dr. William Lane Craig's a big modern day proponent of this. It was basically invented by a guy named Luis de Molina.
Okay.
He was a counter-reformer Jesuit priest who was actually reading a lot of Calvin's stuff and found that he was like in agreement with some of Calvin's stuff to the point that the Pope wanted to excommunicate him, which was crazy. Yeah, so that's a kind of a very basic rundown of Molinism. There's like 3 logical moments to God's omniscience prior to his creative decree. There's like, I'm trying to remember them now. It's like God's natural knowledge, which is like his knowledge of everything he could do logically compatible with his like nature and everything, like everything he could create and do. There's his middle knowledge. So it's his knowledge of everything that could happen in any given set of circumstances that he could, actualize. And then there's his free knowledge. And the free knowledge is, that world he decided to create, that universe, if you will. Again, I'm just kind of
It's a very high-level summary.
It's a lot of philosophical stuff. I never really liked philosophy until I started like trying to understand Molinism. I was kind of forced to try to understand some concepts of philosophy. But anyway, in that conversation, most Calvinists would just hold to, well, there's natural knowledge and there's free knowledge. You don't need middle knowledge. You know? So we were kind of going back and forth on that and talking about it. And yeah, I mean, I'm of the opinion where I don't know if it's true. It makes sense to me. I think it's allowing you to smooths out a lot of road bumps, like roadblocks in the scripture. I think more so than just a basic compatibilism, which is compatibilism is basically that you do. This is kind of the Reformed Jonathan Edwards Reformed belief about free will, that you do according to your greatest inclination. But that inclination is, basically divinely, sovereignly guided, or I wouldn't say guided. It's more like, they wouldn't say that God is like possessing you to do the things. It's more like that God set off a chain of events, one after another, that led to you doing that greatest inclination. It's all, but that it's only, the tape only plays one way, right? It can't go off to the, over here. It can't be A, B, or C. Or not A, B, and C. It's always going to be B. You may think you can choose A or C, but it's going to be B because God decreed it sovereignly and set the record going in that direction.
But it also allows for most common things discussed among Christian circles is God does not cause anyone to sin. And the scripture says that when you're tempted to sin, it's not
right.
It's not God tempting you, right? We know that it happened. Right? So if me and you sin, it happens.
Sure.
And based on what you're saying, one might be able to draw the conclusion that, well, that means that God set that way. And so how is that not God causing me to sin? If that's the tape he set in the direction, right? So how does that...
With Molinism?
Yeah, how do you answer that question?
So, I've used the example before, and I think, I'm trying to remember who came up with this. I think it was... I can't remember his name. Anyway, he wrote a book called Salvation and Sovereignty. Kenneth Heafley. I think that's his name, Kenneth Heafley.
Okay.
I think he used the example that if you have a student who cheats and you're administrating a test, and you leave the room, but you have a camera running to watch the students, the camera, but you leave the room to like go to the bathroom or whatever. You know, if you leave the room, that kid's probably going to look at another kid's test and copy it off and cheat, right?
Right.
You know, and so you have to leave, you got to go to the bathroom and come back, and you check the camera. Sure enough, he waited till he left. He peeked over at the other kid's paper and he copied the answer. You know, every metaphor has its limits, but to just
Right.
kind of give you an idea, the teacher is kind of like God. You know, he allowed for that to happen, like he permitted it, he allowed it, even though he knew he was going to do it. God is not the direct cause, but maybe he's the weak cause of someone committing a sin, right? I mean, he allowed the circumstances, and he knew it was going to happen. You know, does it mean that he's the direct cause? I don't think so. You know,
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
if you have incompatibilism, if the dominoes all fall in one direction and you just hit the first domino, but you didn't hit the second to the last domino that fell, but you set things in, you know, it seems like there's more of a direct cause, you know, and people smarter than I debate and argue about this all the time.
Yeah.
There was a debate with, maybe people could check out, with Tim Stratton and James White. I mean, James White's the proponent of the compatibilist position, and Tim Stratton is a proponent for the Molinist perspective. James White is really good at rhetoric. I think he won that debate, especially he's done like 300 moderated debates. Tim Stratton's done one, you know. But
Yeah.
if you continue to listen to Tim Stratton, and, you know, when he's not like attacked in cross-examination and stuff like that, you know, he's got a PhD, he's written books on it, and he's already writing a second edition of his thesis, which is all about middle knowledge and stuff. You know, there's a lot of good debates on there. Another good one is Kirk McGregor. I mean, Kirk McGregor's he has a really good discussion with I'm gonna forget his name, famous Calvinist. He's a French philosopher. I'll just say that's one of the most helpful discussions I've ever heard between a Calvinist and a Molinist. It was such a high level conversation. And instead of like, I feel like James White a lot of times kind of doesn't answer questions maybe and puts them on the bottom shelf for people like me to grasp from his compatibilist perspective.
Yeah.
This guy really did. Go for it.
One of the things I think we had talked about on that trip was, I feel like you're just explaining predestination
Yeah.
in the same way I would, kind of, but because we're just so limited by the fact that we're humans, there's only so many ways you can explain something this like profound or this mysterious, right? And so it's just kind of like, if you listen to a traditional Reformed Baptist talk about Calvinism, and then you listen to a Molinist talk about Molinism, like different words are used, but I feel like they're just saying
Very
the
similar.
same thing. Another thing that I had pointed out was basically like, oh, it sounds like you're just talking about multiverse. It sounds very, that could just be because, you know,
I mean,
what
I
you
don't
call
like
it.
that, but
But
it can be a useful image to try to explain how.
well, I think that's a flaw in it though, because
By the way, it's Dr. I'm going to screw up his name. Guillaume Benyon.
okay,
Yeah. So there's a discussion on YouTube from 2022. It's Dr. Kirk McGregor versus Dr. Guillaume Benyon. I apologize if I'm butchering your name, because I'm pretty sure I am.
that's okay. He won't hear
Anyway,
this.
his contention in that debate was like, you know, because Calvinism is so similar to Molinism with some minute differences, any criticism that the Molinists may have of Calvinism can come back to blow up in the Molinist face.
Right. Yeah.
And I mean, he kind of demonstrated why. I was like, oh, you know, he's got a point there, you know. So it got me really thinking. But I mean, I'm not married to Molinism. I think it's a good way to explain some things, how you could have language of permission when you're talking about the problem of evil, and like legitimately say God permitted,
Right.
more so than maybe the Calvinist position. But at the same time, I'd like to phrase it as a model, as a framework to explain to maybe an atheist who's trying to understand that, or somebody who's not,
Yeah.
you know, understanding of how God can be sovereign. It's like, well, maybe this is a way that could work together. You know,
Yeah.
I don't have to be dogmatic about it, because
Yeah, I think one of my big things was when you had explained it initially, it was God saw every possibility and set a particular one into motion.
Infinite possibilities.
Infinite possibilities, and so that's why many people will think, well, it just sounds like multiverse, right? Like in a very basic Marvel Cinematic Universe type multiverse like understanding of framework. Obviously, it's not that, but that's how one who is not as well versed might initially understand it, because that's how I did. And what I had said back, I think what you're referring to was, it's not even that. I don't even think I don't think it's God saw these possibilities. I think it's just the reality that has been set into place is what is set into place because that was God's decree.
Right.
But
yes.
not because he sees all these different things. He set into motion what he set into motion. He's not limited by making a decision based on what we will do. And then, like, he's not bound, God is not bound by the multiple choice questions that humans will answer in their day-to-day actions. You know what I mean?
So when you have infinite choices, though, I mean, when you have
Right.
infinite worlds, so to speak, Craig talks about infinite worlds.
Which I just...
When you think about it, though, that infinite's infinite. There's any realm of possibility. So if God
Right.
could easily pick a world, pardon the anthropomorphic language, but like God, he could easily pick a world where you choose not to receive him, or choose to receive him, or stand on, go jump on your bed. I don't know.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
because if it's infinite, there's infinite. As long you could drop out, the worlds where there's married bachelors and square triangles and things that are not logically consistent.
Right.
And you'd still have infinite worlds.
Right.
It's like integers. You drop out the prime numbers or integers or whatever, and you could still have an infinite set of numbers, right?
Yeah, but I think it's, in a way, it's crazy because that's like, wow, that's infinite, right? And that's massive, that's huge. But at the same time, that's a human concept. Well, actually, I shouldn't say it's infinite, because infinite is always related to quantity or time. There might be something else I'm missing, and we know that God is infinite, but that's because that's our attempt to take him out of time. Like when we die, we will live infinitely, but it's not even infinitely. It's just
when we talk
time
about
doesn't exist.
3 logical moments prior to God's creative decree. It's logical moments. Doesn't mean he first sat there and think, "What can I make today?"
Right.
And then
right.
goes, "Wow, I can do all of these infinite worlds, and I don't have to do the ones that are logically incompatible with, like, what's the word I'm looking for? Like square triangles." I mentioned that, and then he's like, "I'm gonna pick this one." It's more like he just knew.
Yeah.
And so when you're in philosophy, you talk about
I wouldn't
logical
think it's like he just
moments.
knew, though.
Well, like for instance, like when you talk about the Ordo Salutis or whatever, the order of salvation, like logically, according to the Calvinistic paradigm, regeneration precedes faith. You know what I mean? Like, you are regenerated, and and even though it may be logically simultaneous, like that happens at the same time, but like logically though, you had to be regenerated by the Holy Spirit before you could have the faith placed in God.
And that was which?
That's the kind of the like R.C. Sproul promotes that idea. I mean, it's fairly pervasive among Calvinism, but like so it's not like 3 moments. Like it's just a way to explain using like philosophical language how it's possible that God thought of all these infinite worlds where he wanted, like, let's say he had his eye, like in Molinism, especially like originalist Molinism, which is closer to what Molina believed, because there's congruous Molinism,
All these different things.
Yeah, there's
tied to one little
there's a
aspect being
spectrum,
different.
and one of the criticisms I have of James White is that he just attacks Craig's version of Molinism, which is much more Arminian, and he talks about things like optimal, salvific, I forget the term. He attacks certain things that many Molinists do not even really hold to. Like, I don't believe in that. The idea that, God created just enough free essences, free human beings in the world that he would get, like he created this world because it was the best possible world to get as many people saved as possible. You know, I don't hold to that. Like he created this world because it was the only world that he could get the most people to receive him freely. You know?
Yeah.
And I don't think so. I think it's a mystery. I think God has his elect.
I don't.
You know, as Molina believed that God had his elect. It's a mystery. I don't know who he's chosen, and he decided to actualize a world where that elect would receive him.
Yeah,
You know?
it's tricky because in one regard that is correct, right? No one comes to the Father but those whom he enables.
Yeah.
And so you say, okay, well, how does that actually like play out in reality?
Yeah.
So in one way, that kind of does lend a hand to that. But then in the other hand, my brain always goes back to like, it's not even choosing which world. It's just he spoke the world into existence. That explanation might lead one to believe like he lost control, right? He spoke it into existence and just said, okay, I'm going to stand back and, see what happens. That's not what I'm saying.
That's more of maybe a simple foreknowledge view of Arminian belief.
Yeah, but I think it's more like I don't think he I think my point was I don't think he needs the knowledge of the other quote unquote worlds or the other possibilities. Mm-hmm. I think what he commanded is so, and that's it.
Right. I mean, and this is an example of why, you may come at it a little different perspective, because that's the classic, Reformed post Jonathan.
But for context, there, I think one of the things I always joke around with John is I always kind of like, I guess I'm Reformed Baptist, because it's just like all of these things that are so understanding the holiness of God and the sovereignty of God, one can naturally arrive at this kind of conclusion where you're not going to catch God off guard, right? And nothing you do is going to surprise him. And for that reason, that's why I kind of end up there. And I didn't grow up in a Reformed Baptist church.
Right.
I grew up
evangelical.
But churches who don't know what they believe is the joke, because they don't want to put it in writing. Where when you go on the church website, all of the EV free churches are like, we believe, and it's basically a copy paste from one church to another. Mm-hmm. It's like, you might as well just call yourself a Baptist, because it's basically, in my limited knowledge of the 1689, was it the London Baptist Confession? Is that what it is?
Mm-hmm. The Second London Baptist Confession of Faith, yeah.
It's basically like, wow, you're saying almost all the same things. The difference is like that confession goes into greater details with like specifics. Mm-hmm. Like, cool, we believe all these things, but also there's these other minute details that we do have a firm stance on.
Sure.
So that's John's belief. For like he said, he's not married to it. It's kind of a framework.
And to your point, God is not limited by his omniscience either.
Yeah.
According to Molinism,
which is crazy.
Awesome
crazy.
He can choose to create certain individual essences who have the capability of free will, and it can even allow for, Dr. Tim Stratton talks about this, you can even allow for, at certain times, God directly intervening, and maybe you don't have free will all the time.
Ooh.
Yeah. But if you have free will at all, though, that kind of defeats compatibilism.
Yeah, that also depends on the definition of free will, I suppose, too. Because
so
when you say free will, this was a learning lesson for me. Someone
it can mean a different thing. So compatibilism, which is more the Calvinistic view, is that you do according. This is a very boilerplate definition. You do according to your greatest inclination at the time. Mm-hmm. Which, if you think about it, it's like that makes sense. But that inclination.
You're good.
Arguably is, it's decreed, but it's like more than that. It's like God sovereignly is exhaustively, sovereignly moving in that direction, right? And then whereas not compatible, so that's compatibilism. Molinism would say you can choose door number 1, door number 3, door number 2. Sorry, out of order, but or
John can't count.
choose. Yeah, it's hard. Molinists can't count. Door number 1, door number 2, door number 3, or refrain from any of those doors. That's true freedom of choice. Whereas in compatibilism, it was going to be door 3. You may think and feel that you could do door 1, but it was always going to be door 3.
Yeah.
But when God actualizes that world, it's going to be door 3 anyway, because he knew you would freely choose to go through door 3 in that universe. And so basically, I think Craig defines Molinism in a very boilerplate way, is that God, he decrees, obviously, but, he causes the circumstances in which you freely choose to do the thing he has sovereignly decreed.
Right.
So,
okay, well.
And, to Dr. I forget his name again, credit, it's true. There's so much similarity between Molinism and 5-point Calvinism. A lot of the criticism we have of Calvinism could kind of boomerang back and hit us in the face.
Right.
So check out that podcast. It was really informative. Got me really thinking.
GUILLAUMEBIGNON. Guillaume Bouillon.
Bouillon or
But
something like
there's
that.
still Christians left in France. What the heck? That's weird.
He used to be an atheist.
Oh, those are the best.
Yeah, and then
I
he
love those.
converted.
That's so good.
It's crazy. So,
Dude.
yeah.
So
That's like the most exhaustive thing you'll ever hear about it.
Okay. So you're not married to it. That's great. I'm more go with the flow. I ended up in a church and I went, oh wow, they seem to be preaching what I believe. Oh, and it happens to be a Reformed Baptist. So that's both of us. Aside from Molinism, what else did we have written down?
Well, we talked about about sign gifts.
Oh yes, we did talk about that.
And the sign gifts are like the gift of miracles, the word of knowledge, prophecy, speaking in tongues.
So basically, the charismatics versus the Baptists, the Reformed Baptists.
Continuationism versus charismania versus the cessationists.
See, to me, charismania and sensationists are the same thing. Sensationists, what you said?
Well, I'm going to mess up.
Caesarean
Cessationists
section.
are like John MacArthur, Strange Fire conferences. They don't believe the sign gifts are around anymore. They died in the 1st century after the New Testament canon was closed. That's the typical cessationist view.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, right? Because like we have a lot of charismatic friends. This is the interesting thing is like we're pretty conservative. What our culture, basic Christian culture would call as conservative.
Yes.
And whatever that entails, right? Whatever, they might not even be able to define specifically what that means. But for the most part, if you tell someone I'm pretty conservative as a Christian, they'll know what you're talking about. Kind of, you're probably not speaking in tongues every Sunday. You're probably not
right. There's not gold flakes floating around in my office. Right.
We don't
play Christian music
unless you're John and you go to the Fog Machine Church. But but we have a lot of charismatic friends.
Church.
The what?
Just for the record, we don't have fog machines in my church.
Yeah, not anymore.
No. Well, my new church doesn't have fog machines.
But we have a lot of.
I did go to another church that had fog machines.
You silly
we always
boy.
joke about that.
The church you go to has fog machines?
It doesn't.
Okay, good.
The other church did.
Yeah,
so
that drives me crazy, man.
Oh man, they'll kick on the fog machines at my old church about like maybe 5 minutes into this worship set. So it's like, oh, the Holy Spirit's coming. It's allowed to come in now.
The Holy Spirit can't move if the fog machine's not on. That's the only way it can, traverse physical space or something.
This is true.
But yeah, we have a lot of charismatic friends who would probably be on the opposite spectrum of us in terms of like, the nitty gritty as to the gifts of the Spirit and pedo Baptists and just, a whole range of issues, right?
Right.
And it's always so funny because it's like, one of the reasons we wanted to do this was this podcast was like, I think we have a very like, I don't know if down to earth is the right word, but like, I feel like every podcast that I listen to, the person speaking is like so certain that what they're saying
Real dogmatic.
is what does dogmatic mean? I don't even like.
Just this is how it is the
Like
only
this is how it is.
correct
It's,
interpretation of this thing.
And like you're wrong if you don't. And it's kind of like, can't we just be like, this doesn't really matter if you're right or wrong. Like you can obviously you can have an opinion on how you might interpret this or that, but like who cares? Who cares?
Right.
So, but
minor
yeah, we
on
have
the minors, major on the majors. You know, we
Right.
believe in the resurrection. We believe that Christ is fully God, fully man.
Right.
You know, those are the majors, right?
and then everything else.
Right.
Like one
The rapture of the church is
Yeah.
maybe a minor. If he's a pre-trib, post-trib, or not at all, is it the same thing as the second coming? You know, that kind of thing.
Yeah, and I like one of my other very close friends is opposite of me in all of those things. And this friend of ours is like just in love with Jesus. You know what I mean? And I always joke like she's a better Christian than I am.
Mm-hmm.
And like if you just write down, if you put it on paper, you just kind of go, "Oh yeah, she loves the Lord." I mean, sure, she has a lot of things incorrect. That's like, you know, I firmly believe she has a lot of things incorrect, but those incorrect things are not the major things.
Right.
And like, what can you do? So I think I am also of the opinion like, if she's right and I'm wrong, so be it.
Mm-hmm.
Right? It's not like she's saying she's not saying, well, Jesus was not God, right? It's not one of the it's, you know, we can all go into the same room and worship,
Right.
and it's great.
Right.
And yeah, we, you know, in a perfect world, we would all agree on the exact same theology, but that's not perfect.
Right.
Or we don't live in a perfect world. And I'm reminded, like, who was it that said, Paul, they're basically preaching this other thing, and Paul says, don't stop them from preaching. Or is it Jesus? I forget now.
Paul said that.
Paul said that. Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm not going too crazy. But Paul's like, don't stop them from preaching that. Let them preach what they're preaching.
Even if they're doing it out of bad motives, at least the
Yeah, at least the word's going
getting
out.
preached.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you just kind of go, okay. And so that kind of lends, like, I think we've all had friends who are like, maybe they're new Christian at some point, and you go, oh, are you going to that church? Are you sure? And you just kind of got to step back and say, God will use this as a stepping stone if he needs to.
God uses means.
God uses means. And if they are saved, which in almost every one of those situations, I say almost because, I mean, that's the best observational evidence that we have, right? It's never 100%, which is super sad, but almost every time they're saved. And it happens to be that the church they go to is kind of,
Yeah. When you talk about, I think a lot of people in the cessationist camp, which is the camp that believes that the gifts have gone away after about the first century when the canon was closed. I mean, I think a lot of times in the cessationist camp, and I talked to some people who are cessationists, who are my close friends, they would just say, I think a lot of times they're thinking about the more crazy side of it, you know, some of the videos you see on reels and stuff that people use to make fun of it, like Benny Hinn swinging his coat around like a lightsaber and cutting people down on the stage, you know.
Who did that?
Benny Hinn.
Oh, Benny Hinn. Yeah.
You know, total like
All
word of
the-
faith,
yeah,
prosperity
the
gospel,
prosperity and TV preachers.
hyper-charismatic guy, right?
Knocking people down with coats.
Right. So people look at that and they go, that is absolutely repulsive.
Yeah,
you
which
know?
they're not wrong.
Oh, sure. I'm repulsed by it.
Yeah, it's such a cheap gospel.
It looks
a
so
cheap
much
fake
like a
gospel.
circus, you know.
Yeah,
And it is really.
yeah.
You know, and I mean, over the years, they've busted so many like prosperity teachers using cheap parlor tricks to
Yep.
do miracles and stuff.
That's
I mean,
true.
Dateline did stuff on it,
Yeah.
you know. But anyway, like, so I think a lot of cessationists rightfully think, well, that's wrong. So, you know, I don't think those gifts are around anymore, you know. And one of the things they mentioned, like, for instance, the gift of healing. You know, it's like, and they make a good point. Like, if somebody has the gift of healing, if that gift was still around, then how come we never see them go into the hospitals and heal people?
Right.
You know?
Exactly. Who was it that just made that? I think my pastor just made that joke is never ask a prosperity teacher or a prosperity preacher or someone who's, you know, healing everybody with the coat, running down the aisle, running their jacket coat over everyone,
Right.
why they're wearing glasses.
Oh, yeah.
Right? You
Yeah,
go,
exactly.
oh, wait a minute, there's a flaw here, right? But I don't. How did we get on this? What were we talking about?
We're just talking about the sign gifts.
Oh yeah.
So
there's
some people don't
examples
believe
of how
they
to,
exist anymore because they see the abuses and they kind of go
Right.
maybe
That's what it was.
overcorrect
Yeah.
to the they just probably aren't here because it's a more I guess a more safe place to be doctrinally speaking.
Which I don't think
and I kind of understand.
is you kind of can't blame them, right?
No.
Like, okay, like
especially if they come out from a place that's like that, right?
yeah, if you're gonna go, okay, well, I might as well play it safe because the worst, well, what's the worst that could happen, right? And then you think, okay, well, what are the exceptions to that?
Mm-hmm.
And something we talked about in the car to get the mic stand that you're using now, from like, was it 45 minutes ago? You have kind of, I think the only example that we arrive at as generally speaking conservative Christians is your stereotypical, I'm in Africa, I need to proclaim the word, and I had the gift of tongues.
Mm-hmm.
And I was able to speak the language of this person or whatever.
And you hear stories
which I have
like
heard.
that.
I have heard from some of our friends.
Right.
Like they witnessed it, and I go,
so the gifts aren't
wow.
dead.
Right, exactly. But then you kind of wonder, like,
because God can do anything; He's sovereign, right?
Right, and that's I go, wow. You know
what?
That happened, great.
You know what though? If you really were to drill down with a cessationist, like somebody who goes to master seminary or something, they'd be like, "Yeah, I believe that too." So how different? Again, this is like, where are we more alike than we are different?
Is that only allowed? So I think what divides us is that only allowed in that stereotypical Africa example?
I think a cessationist would typically say that the gifts are actual languages. Mm-hmm. They're not angelic languages. Mm-hmm. I don't know if I agree with that, but
the text says, doesn't the text
in
say
Acts chapter
angelic?
2, absolutely.
The word angelic is there.
So in Acts chapter 2 and in other instances where some other instance where the gift of tongues was spoken, specifically in Acts chapter 2, that people there could hear them speaking in their own language.
Exactly.
So yeah, I think that's definitely a manifestation of the gift.
But I think, and the word angelic is in there too.
So in 1 Corinthians 13, what the continuationists would say is, if I speak with the tongues of men or of angels.
Of angels, there you go. Yeah.
But do not have love, then I'm just a, clashing cymbal or whatever, right?
So we have, I can speak whatever language, remote language, and then I can speak of the angelic language. Mm-hmm.
That's what a continuationist / charismatic would believe. Charismatics are probably a little more charismatic. So a continuationist is probably a little more reserved than they just believe the gifts still exist, and arguably,
but not widely.
Right. Like it's not like.
Not every Sunday.
Yeah,
like
and
the charismatic.
you're not. It's not a sign that you're saved, right? That you have to speak in tongues to be saved.
Okay, yeah.
That's more of a Pentecostal belief.
That's like another friend of mine who was recently, well, I say recently, it's probably been at least a year or so, but for all intents and purposes, recently saved. Saved in a church like that.
Right.
And I kind of go, ooh, I wish you weren't going to that church. But again, she believes the gospel.
Yeah.
So what do you do with that, right?
Yeah.
So
to go back to the healings thing, well, let me talk about tongues for just a second. So I think somebody, and I'll just cut to the chase. I believe I have this gift.
Okay. Which is interesting because we're conservative Christians.
Right. And I've only spoken in tongues I could probably count on like one hand.
Ooh, what was that like?
Interesting.
Shit about a Honda, said about a Yamaha?
No, it's like I've heard people talk about how they train people to speak in tongues to do it on demand.
I saw that on the 700 Club once. I was just dying
and I'm
inside.
Just
I'm like, oh my gosh.
I've never had that experience where I had to sit there and cook up the tongues.
Right.
It's more like and it usually always is in a time of really deep worship with God.
Okay.
Like I'm really.
Are we talking?
So either at home or in church.
Are we talking when you say worship? Because worship, even in the Christian circle, is just as assumed music.
Sure,
which is not true. Mm-hmm. That's something.
Yeah, worship
I'm pretty
is not just
about.
Limited to music, but
so in your situation, was it music related?
It was mostly music. Okay. Yeah, and I know so it's like, oh, you got all
into the moment.
Right? Yeah, I mean, but I feel like it's more than that because when I I remember, like, I'll give you one example. I was worshiping the Lord. I was listening to music at home, and no one was in the house, and I was just playing worship music. And then in the course of me singing the songs over like the course of like a half hour, the more I felt that I could resonate with the words.
Yeah, you're in the moment, you know.
And I'm singing those words in a, you know, oblation to God. Like I'm
Yeah.
saying, yeah, Lord, I do surrender. Like the more I'm like kind of giving my heart into it, then I felt the Spirit
That's so interesting.
come upon me, and I felt like I'm saying words. I feel like there are other words. English can't just capture what I'm trying to say to God, and that's
Okay.
when I start
Ooh,
saying things that.
that's
and it's
so
just
interesting.
to me.
That's fat. See,
you
I've,
know?
I've never had such an experience, but I know another friend who lives in Colorado who has had a very similar experience, if not the same.
Interesting.
And I just kind of go, that's first off, I would love to have such a moment where you're just, I need to elevate my speech to a whole nother level, or rather, even maybe perhaps even more beautifully, how great is it that God is now elevating that speech for me via this gift? That sounds awesome.
Yeah, and it's not like I didn't have control or something,
Right.
right? Like the spirit of the prophets are subject to the prophets. I mean, that's
You weren't rolling around on the floor.
I couldn't, you know, because the people who have the charismatic gifts, some of the more charismatic, the more extreme, they say, well, like, you know, it's the spirit. I can't control it. That's not
Yeah.
true. If the spirit is subject to the prophets, then the spirit's subject to the prophets, right? You have control.
So I would say,
But it's when you speak in tongues, it's like I feel this impression upon me to say things that aren't English. And it's not like the Holy Spirit's getting in my mouth and like flapping my tongue around or
Right,
something.
right.
It's like I'm feeling this, you know,
you just can't, it's just
yeah,
supernatural.
Like I need to say things that aren't English. You know what I mean?
That's crazy. That's awesome.
So that's my limited experience, you know, and it only happens so I can't do it on demand, you know. Like there are times, even when I'm emotional, I'm in worship, I don't want to speak in tongues.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
So
I think a lot of the sign gifts work that way. It's when God decides to fill you, and yeah, you have that gift, but it's God who ultimately decides when that gift will be exercised.
Exactly.
And it's
Yeah.
going to be with you because he gave you that gift. And the same goes with healing. That's why you don't see people with the gift of healing going to the hospitals just arbitrarily healing
Right,
people.
right.
It's because when God decides to heal, he will use that person a lot of times. He can use other people too,
Yeah.
but he may use that vessel because he gave him specifically that ministry and that gift.
It's an interesting concept because obviously God's not limited by where somebody is at one time. God could heal without somebody.
Absolutely.
And so that raises two questions. So first off, I'm very see it to believe it kind of guy.
Sure.
So I don't not believe you when you tell me you spoke in tongues. I think that's awesome. But at the same time, my first instinct is,
This is why we're doing the podcast.
I know it's great.
I love it.
I'll just trash talk you later. That's fine.
Do it now. No.
My initial inclination is, where in the scriptures do you see a similar example of that happening? Because if I just off the top of my head, without diving deep, the only thing I can think of is when it talks about those gifts, it's usually in the group of people and for a specific purpose.
Encouragement.
Paul says you need a translator if someone has the gift of tongues.
Right. Which kind of blows the whole concept that it's just other languages out of the water.
Yeah, but
because why would
yeah.
an interpreter be needed?
Well, you could have
But what's the point? Just speak
so-
Aramaic or something.
right. Well, so the only thing I could think of would be a very specific use case. So first off, to me, it's a mystery. I think to me, I'm comfortable leaving it a mystery because I just don't have at least currently in my life now, I don't have that, like, I guess the drive or that, I think the mental energy to try to figure out what does this mean? Like, I don't need to understand it 100%, but the only thing I can think of is just a very practical, like, someone is preaching in the street in, I don't know. Well, no, because even then, that's in the context of the church, right?
What? that you can
that you need an interpreter. That would be what with a body of believers.
Yeah. So if somebody spoke in
It's
a
not like a
tongue-
street preacher out there preaching something, and then someone's next to him translating in. It just happens to be some dude who speaks this one-off language, and he's spiritually led to now translate into that language, right? I don't think that's the context, although I suppose that's possible.
So for instance, and this happened to my friend. He was at a church that's continuationist, and they were doing a worship night, and somebody stood up and gave a word in tongues.
Ooh.
And he felt, as he was speaking in tongues, he felt like he knew what he was saying.
Whoa!
Like he had this impression. This, and I was like, but he didn't want to say anything.
Yeah.
And he said somebody else stood up and gave the exact same thing he was thinking.
Ooh.
And I was like,
see,
that's crazy.
That's what I'm saying. Like you hear these stories and you go, dude, that's
stories,
nuts.
right?
It's so awesome.
Yeah. So it's
like it's kind of scary. It kind of scary. I'm not gonna. It's just, for whatever reason, it's scary.
Yeah, it's crazy.
So first question
Yeah.
is, so where else do you see that? So I guess the example you gave is in church. So my question is,
in 1 Corinthians 14 through 16 gives basically a lot of guidelines on how to exercise the gifts because they were getting out of control.
Got it.
In the Corinthian church.
Getting all Benny Hinn up in there.
So they were basically doing, what a lot of churches unfortunately do, where it's just chaos. And Paul was saying, look, you need to, like, for instance, he says 2 or at the most 3 get up, speak in tongues, and sit down, and then leave it at that, which tells you that it is controlled, right?
Right.
And he talks about an instance, and I don't have the Bible in front of me, but I know that he talks about in that passage, doing it in a church setting. If you're going to do it in the hearing of other people, make sure their interpreter is present, which is interesting. It's like, how do you know unless you So I have a question about that. But
Yeah.
or if you're just doing it between you and God.
So it does lay that out.
So it does indicate that there is a time where you could speak in tongues. Like I wouldn't speak in tongues in church service unless it was like while the music's blasting and it's just me and God.
No one can hear me,
and no one
guys.
can hear me.
Well, the
right?
music's always blasting in your church, so that's
that's
fine.
true. Like we go to this church in San Diego and we're down there. It's like people are so, I don't know, when the worship goes off and they do it for like 30 minutes uninterrupted.
Oof.
And everybody in that church, I don't know, you could just see it in their face. They're just like, they want to like hug Jesus.
Yeah. Well, they're in the moment.
And you can really, like, there's been a number of times I've gone to that church and, worshiped and I get like, wow, I can feel like the passion here.
Yep. Sometimes I joke with Laurel all the time. I go, man, I got to go to a charismatic church this weekend or something. I need to like feel something for
They're
once.
like a charismatic light church because like, I've never heard people speak in tongues, but I've heard people get words of knowledge and stuff like that, but I'm sure it happens.
So once at
Sure.
a mutual friend, they were doing like the gifts of prophecy. And so it was like, if you want to have someone speak prophecy over you, go up to the front. And I'm just kind of like, I think I'm okay. Like I don't know. I'm all right. I'm okay.
Right.
Like it just seems so odd and so odd. But again, I'm the conservative Christian, right? I mean, I guess the worst thing is like,
and
what they're saying is not true, but it just it doesn't.
To be fair, I can understand. I mean, I watched some of Jeff Durbin's, podcast with people who came out of Bethel, and there was some, spiritual weirdness going on there. I don't like to pick on any specific churches or name names or whatever, but like,
just name them. Who cares?
It seemed like that girl's experience. One of the people they were interviewing at their worship ministry, at they have a school of supernatural ministry or something.
Yeah.
At Bethel, and it sounds like
yeah.
there's not the main church, but maybe the school gets a little, based on multiple people, not just her. It sounds like there's some practices that go on that are a little extra biblical. You know what I'm saying?
I know what you're saying.
And so you can definitely see how like, and I had a friend who came out of a Pentecostal church, and he was just so beat up from the Pentecostal church because of all the spiritual manipulation.
Right.
Well, the Lord told me, and placing your hand violently on their head and casting out a demon kind of thing, like you have a demon, I'm gonna cast a demon out on you, and it's like, I'm just going through something, man.
It's possible that your life doesn't go well in certain seasons, and it does not mean you have a demon. It just means Like, did Job have a demon? I know we have
That's right.
everyone goes back to Job as like the perfect example for stuff, but like Job didn't have it. He just that what happened.
So I can definitely
yeah.
see how you come out of an environment like that or raised in an environment like that, and you're just like got people abuse the "Thus saith the Lord" thing, and to kind of get you to do what they wanted or whatever, whether they intended to or not. And a lot of times, I think they probably did intend it. You know, and it's spiritual manipulation. Let's call it what it is.
So how do we find a healthy charismatic church?
Oh, man.
See, that's hard.
I was reading Wayne Grudem's Systematic Theology the other day, and he was talking about the gift of prophecy, and he's somebody who's a continuationist.
Mm-hmm.
You know, he was friends with John Wimber, who founded the Vineyard Movement, it's a much more charismatic spinoff of Calvary Chapel.
Okay.
You know, in fact, they split from Calvary Chapel because they were way more charismatic than Calvary Chapel was, right?
They like to clap their hands in church.
You know,
imagine that in
people
my
getting
church.
slain in the spirit, that sort of thing, you know, and that was kind of beyond what Calvary Chapel would allow. But anyway,
I think understandably so, though.
But John Wimber, he made not John Wimber, sorry, Wayne Grudem in his Systematic Theology was talking about how, you know, people go a little crazy with the gift of prophecy and say, "Thus saith the Lord."
Yeah.
You know, and you shouldn't do that.
Yeah, that's kind of risky.
You should say,
man, that's
and he would say that he thinks that when somebody who's for instance, who's a cessationist belief, I got an impression from the Lord. Like, I think the Lord's telling me to do this thing. You know, I prayed about this, and I think God's given me this impression to do that.
It's very reserved. I took my time. I didn't just jump to it.
He thinks it's the same thing. He
prayed about it.
He thinks it's the Lord giving you a prophecy.
Yeah.
You know, he thinks prophecy and impressions he's like charismatic gift of prophecy and, you know, cessationist, you know, I got an impression about something. Mm-hmm. He thinks it's one and the same.
Interesting.
And he made a good case for that. And I don't know if it's 100% or not, but he was saying, like, we need to stop saying "Thus saith the Lord," because sometimes, and even he pointed out a story in the book of Acts where somebody came up to Paul and said, "Hey, if you go to this city, the Jews will, you know, arrest you and take you to Rome." Mm-hmm. You know, and he said, "That's what I heard from the Lord," basically. Mm. And if you read the story, that's not really what happened. The Jews started rioting, and then the Romans came in, and they were going to take him. The Jews were like, "No, we're going to take him and I think stone him, I think." Mm. And they're like, "No, we're going to take him, and, you know, he's a Roman citizen or whatever," and they arrested him for causing a disturbance or something, right?
Yeah.
You know, I'm butchering the story, but the point that Wayne Grudem said with that story is that the guy didn't get his facts right. You know, like, God gave him an impression, and maybe his understanding of it was limited, so the details were not completely accurate.
Right.
You know, so I mean, it kind of gave him an excuse for why so many prophecies, I guess, sometimes are not 100% come to pass. You know, so he was saying be very careful. We're still in our flesh. You know, the God may be impressing you to do something
mm-hmm.
or tell somebody something. You know, don't say like "Thus saith the Lord" or whatever. Say, I think the Lord's telling me something, and I'm not sure.
I've never even heard that myself, to be honest.
What?
I've never even heard that myself I've never been to a charismatic, and I'm not as well versed in the practices of the charismatic church, although I do have some family that go to a charismatic church. I've never really asked them about it because they weren't too happy when I told them that Joel Osteen is kind of not what you think he is.
Yeah,
which,
I mean,
you know,
that's the other thing too. If you think about the gifts, the charismatic, you know, movement is kind of ganged up with the word of faith. You know, prosperity
it's
gospel.
like a very thin line,
and they're like kind of like married together, and you know, and it's just.
I'm sure there's people who, in the rare off chance they actually hear this, would be like, "No, we're not." But it's kind of like, at least from our perspective, as a traditional conservative Christian, that's kind of the perspective we get because, well, I think it's just because I don't know, maybe we're incorrectly assuming that just because both of those groups happen to practice certain things a certain way, mm-hmm. that they appear to be the same. Mm-hmm. Perfect example.
Well, we see that's what's visible. That's what people talk about a lot. That's what's on TV a lot.
Yeah.
Is the Word of Faith, Prosperity, TBN, right? Trinity Broadcasting Network, stuff, and we see the gifts and stuff getting abused. And that's what's so visible, and people see that and go, that's crazy. That is not like what Paul was talking about, where he said 2 or at the most 3, and let everything be done in, decently and in order.
Yeah.
Right. And so people turn the, overcorrect the other way and say they're just not here anymore.
So what about the opposite? Because someone's, growing up in our EV free churches.
Mm-hmm. Did you grow up EV free?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Something that I heard, and sometimes I think I've heard it even outside of that, beyond that, but I have the gift of administration, or kindness, or kind of more general. Like, I've always got the impression that, like, I could be wrong in this statement, so don't crucify me over it, but I don't think I have the gift of being able to work on cars. I think I just like to work on cars.
Sure.
And so I think there are people who are naturally good at administration, and maybe they enjoy doing it. I don't think that necessarily means it's a spiritual gift. You know what I mean? I kind of feel like maybe the whole spiritual gifts thing is like over applied in that regard. So on the complete opposite spectrum of I'm going to speak in tongues. Now it's just like, well, we're just going to say that these, what I would consider ordinary things, well, it must be a gift because you like to do it or you're good at it. Like
you like Rosetta Stone software, and
it's like,
you travel to like 3 or 4 European countries, and you like to speak the language.
Yeah, you must have the gift of tongues, man. Like, it's like I can think of a few people in my church who are like the math people, like the accounting guys, right? And I go, I don't think they have a spiritual gift at math. I think they just like math,
Right.
But I could be wrong. I think maybe I'm sure there is someone out there who said after I was saved, for whatever reason, I was just drawn to making sure the church buildings don't fall apart.
Yeah.
And so what, you have the gift of maintenance? Maybe. I mean, maybe. But,
yeah, I definitely think there's some gifts that are not exhaustively listed in the New Testament.
Yeah. Yeah. We don't. And so what do we do with that? Do we just say, okay, do we take the same kind of reserved approach?
I definitely know that
it kind of doesn't matter in the long run, but
when you become a new creation in Christ, old things have passed away and all things become new. I definitely think that there's giftings that God gives you that are new. Like all of a sudden I'm like, I want to be hospitable to people and open my home up to people. Whereas before I never would do that. It was all about me, and I'm very selfish,
The cynical person in me just is kind of saying, I'm not sure it's because you were saved. I think it's just you don't hate your life anymore, so you like to be around people.
Sure, but I mean,
you never know, man.
You never know. A work of the Spirit.
Yeah.
I mean, and I would even say like maybe you did have a gift of administration, like you liked organizing things and keeping things running at your office or whatever. But now you're doing it for a sanctified purpose because the Spirit lives in you now. Could that be a gift of administration that's now being sanctified, like something you had a talent for that now it's been sanctified, that God could use for his purposes, and you want to do it out of love for him.
Yeah, maybe it's
and that wouldn't have happened without the Spirit residing in you. Is that something?
But that would be like the gift of obedience.
Yeah.
Like I'm not going to complain about it. I know I'm good at the math, so I'm going to just do the finances for the church. I'm not complaining, and I'm super happy to do it. Joyful, like genuinely joyful in doing it.
That's a good question.
So like,
I haven't really thought about it.
Like, is it the gift of obedience, joy, or math, or all three of them, or is it just that's just who you are? So,
well, I don't know if there's a gift of obedience. I mean, you're called to obey. I don't think the New Testament specifically lists obedience.
I mean, I guess that's true, right? Yeah, maybe that's a bad
faith.
Example, but I think you know what I mean. Like,
there's the gift of faith. I mean, I know people who are like, "Don't worry, the Lord's going to come through," and I'm like, okay, we all have faith, but it seems like some people have this special anointing where they're like, yeah, the Lord's in this and he's going to do it and we got to hang on.
Well, that's a whole nother subject, but that's more like everything's going to be great. Not necessarily. Like, many Christians have died a terrible death.
Oh, sure. But I'm saying like there are some people where God's given them this gift of faith where they know what they're supposed to do. And
I see what you mean.
You know what I mean? And there's this thing that God's called that group to do for whatever reason, and God uses that person a lot of times to encourage the other believers to keep pressing forward. That's
a good point. All right, well,
So I guess the thing that makes maybe my view a little bit unique, and maybe I haven't heard a lot of people talk about this, and there's probably a whole sect of people who believe this, but I think that it's not that you can use the gifts on demand whenever you want. It's more like that if God wants to do a healing or wants someone to speak in tongues, he's going to use you because he's given you that gift when he decides to fill you
Right.
with that,
on
with the
his
Spirit,
schedule.
and to do it at that time.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? And
I agree. I generally agree with that. I think
Yeah.
that's probably for us conservative folks, the best application of the spiritual gifts. Can't write them out completely because
Right.
we know people who have.
Well,
We
even
have
if you look in
eyewitness
church
testimony,
history,
right?
you know, even if you look in church history, yeah, I think there's a couple fathers who said, "Oh yeah, it died in the first century," but there are other fathers who said that it continued on well into the third and fourth centuries.
Yeah.
You know, it's like, well, that was long after the canon was completed. So, you know, I have to look up the names. I forgot who the fathers were who said what I just said, but you know, so it's interesting.
Yeah.
You know, and I think sometimes we, maybe because we don't believe the gifts are around, that maybe we don't.
We're not exactly keeping our eyes open for it either.
Right. Or, you know, because Paul says to earnestly desire the best gifts, especially that you would prophesy, you know.
Yeah.
And if we don't
That's
really
true.
believe the gift of prophecy is around, maybe we're, you know, not experiencing as much. I don't know.
It's hard to say. Yeah,
Yeah.
maybe it's like a it's like a seasonal thing. Prophecy's back on the menu, guys. I'm just waiting for Starbucks to give me my Irish cream cold brew back.
Yeah.
That's all I'm waiting for.
You know, it comes out like in October.
No, I ran into the dude at the post office. The guy, because small town, right? I'm like, hey, you work at Starbucks. You have given me coffee too many times, which actually reminds me, I haven't seen that dude there in a heck of a long time. But I'm like, when you guys are going to get the Irish cream cold brew back? And he's like, yeah, I don't know. We told Starbucks, like corporate, people really love it and they're asking about it. But for whatever reason, they're not bringing it back. It's like, okay. But yeah, maybe it's like a seasonal thing or just, you know, there's examples of absences of certain aspects that Christians might experience in the word, right? And so I don't know, maybe it's dormant.
Well, sure. I mean, like, you know, people talk about the gift of healing. Well, the gift of healing was still around when Paul was
That dude was healing. What was it? Healing things with like towels and stuff. He's like,
like a
talks to-
handkerchief. or
Yeah.
something.
They touched it and they were all healed. I go,
Yeah,
wow,
I
that's
think
awesome.
was that Peter or Paul?
I don't
think
know.
it was Peter.
I forgot.
But the thing is like, I'm sure Paul, of all people, knew people with the gift of healing. Why didn't they heal him when he had his thorn in the flesh?
Ooh, good question.
You know? So
That's a great question.
it's
yeah.
because it's not on demand.
Yeah.
It's something that God disperses as he pleases.
Yeah.
And a lot of times I think he uses those people he's given the gift of healing.
Yep.
But as he sees fit. Because, I mean, we all know people who, I mean, I know people who've been healed miraculously. You know, I've
Really?
known people, yeah.
I don't.
Yeah, the
Yeah.
president of a school I taught at for a while.
Really?
Yeah, he did a he did LSD in the
Let's go. No.
yeah, in the 70s, and he had a bad trip and he didn't like come back from it.
Oh, wow.
You know, and he was in like an institution. Everything was really bad.
Wow.
You know, he thought he was dead and stuff. And then he took him to church, and he said that when the pastor laid hands on him to pray for him, you know, because he felt like God was telling him to go up, you know, like he felt like, I want to get up and get healed, you know.
Yeah.
And then the pastor actually laid hands on him and prayed for him. He said he saw like light flash across his vision, and he said in that moment his understanding came back to him.
Whoa.
Yeah, and
I mean,
now he's got like a PhD.
They talk about
and-
laying hands on one another as well.
Yeah,
In Scripture.
That's one thing Wayne Grudem says. He says, you know, the Bible says that you lay hands on people
Yeah.
and you anoint them with oil. And if you're an elder, call the elders, you know.
There's this one clip. It's all the, again, not to beat the dead horse, but all the conservative bigwigs. They have Piper. I think
Piper's a continuationist too. I think he believes in the gifts.
Yeah. MacArthur, I think, was up there. And then those are the only two I remember because that's
Mortal
really...
Kombat.
Mortal Kombat. Those are the only two that I really like. I don't even really follow them. I just know of them because they pop up from time to time.
Yeah.
I used to follow... I don't know if follow is the right word, but I used to listen to Piper a lot more when I was younger. But not so much anymore because I've really leaned into, like, Like you go to church and let your pastor do his job. Like let him be your pastor. Like you don't need. I mean, it doesn't hurt to have we have such a wealth of knowledge, right? But I'm not going to be like staunchly. I listen to this guy and everything he says is correct. Like no. You can't be doing that.
Like no, I'm not going to mention that.
But it was like 4 or 5 of like prominently known pastors, and they were laying hands on one of the other pastors who was super sick, and I just thought, whoa,
that's awesome.
That to be in that moment.
Especially when they don't some of those people don't believe in the gift.
Yeah, I know. But I don't think he was healed, but still.
Well, and again, to be fair, even though they don't believe in the gift of healing per se, like some have abused it, they still believe that God heals, right? So, even like John MacArthur and his ilk would still believe that God heals today.
Right.
They just don't believe that what you see on television is
right.
So real.
There's a very true healing that God exercises, and there's a very false healing that people use to manipulate other people.
Oh yeah.
And it just sucks that the one that most people know about is the false healing. So I think we're an hour into it. I think people have left. So we're going to call it there, I think. We literally didn't talk about any of the things we wrote down because we just let it go into it. Cool. Well, that was fun. We'll have to do it again. Hopefully we'll have another mic stand, and I won't have to literally wear a headset. So if the audio has been terrible this whole time, apologies to everyone. We don't have pop filters, so sorry. It's very much this is for fun, and hopefully we can, like we said, just be normal people who, we don't have all our stuff together. We don't see ourselves as some elevated position, a position of authority, like many other people on podcasts might. And I think within reason, pastors and so on, we're definitely not that. That was fun. We will, I guess, see everyone in the next one, and hopefully it'll be a little more spicy next time. We'll talk about women in ministry. All right, guys, take care.
We'll mansplain women in ministry.
Thanks for listening. If there's something you heard that you'd like for us to discuss in more detail, feel free to let us know in the comments below. You can also email us at projecttruthbook@gmail.com.